Okay. Good morning and welcome. My name is Mary Tran and I'm here with Stella Kim. So first and foremost, we just want to thank you for attending our workshop. Today we are going to be discussing addressing anti-Asian racism. All right, so I'm sure during your keynote you would have done a land acknowledgement. And what you see on the screen today is the TDSB's land acknowledgement that we hear in the mornings in our schools. And I'm just going to offer today my own personal land acknowledgement. As land acknowledgements are a practice, they are also a part of a larger process working towards reconciliation between non-Indigenous and Indigenous peoples. As a settler on this land, I recognize the history of colonialism, and I am committed to working towards reconciliation, allyship, and solidarity. While we meet today on a virtual platform, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands which we call home. In particular, for me today, where I am situated, I acknowledge the territories of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Huron-Wendat, and Ojibwe Chippewa peoples, land that is home to the Métis and most recently the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations, who are direct descendants of the Mississaugas of the Credit. So please join me in a moment of reflection to acknowledge the past and to consider how we can each, in our own way, move forward in the spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. All right, thank you. Okay, so Stella and I join you today as two of the authors of the resource shown here, Addressing Anti-Asian Racism, a resource for educators. I believe if you scan the QR code or type in the bit.ly, you'll have access to the resource. And I also believe Stella has also put the link in the chat.
Oh, I can do
that. Oh, no, you did
yes.
not. Oh, sorry. That was the link you sent me earlier in the chat. I'm sorry.
Oh, good. Here you go.
This resource, okay, thank you. So if you'd like to have access, the document is a public document. So this resource is a collaboration produced by the Elementary Teachers Union and the Toronto District School Board. It was created in 2020 to highlight and educate on key ideas about anti-Asian racism, including its history in Canada and its current manifestations and impacts on students. Its goal is to help educators to recognize, confront, and interrupt anti-Asian racism.
Throughout the session, we sort of were thinking about 3 overall learning goals, and we thought about them through a bunch of different questions. So in this continuous presentation, we'll be attempting to address a context. So why this resource right now, and then some key ideas around what we feel like folks should know about Asian identities in Canada, about students' experiences of anti-Asian racism and those experiences more broadly, and as well thinking about how schools and communities are approaching these issues. So schools are doing some work in thinking through issues of anti-oppression in their spaces, and there are also, of course, resources outside of school. We're going to try to keep about 15 minutes at the end for comments and questions. All right, so let's get started. And this part is really about setting that context. What you see on the screen are some headlines. And we want to start off by acknowledging that in the midst of this global pandemic, maybe because of it, we have this heightened societal awareness of issues of social justice, of race and racism. And we want to be upfront and acknowledge that anti-Indigenous, anti-Black, and anti-Asian racism are unique and unmistakable. We can think about the hate mail and Zoom attacks that TDSB educators, including Tyler Robinson, were subjected to after they shared about some powerful anti-Black racism course materials that they created in response to student voice. And they shared this with the media. After George Floyd's killing, students had told teachers that they felt like their Blackness was a burden and they didn't want to be Black anymore. And educators responded. Also think of Joyce Echaquan, who died in a Quebec hospital last year seeking treatment for stomach pain. According to an investigative report, shortly after Joyce arrived at the hospital, she was labeled a drug addict. And as a result, her appeals for help were not taken seriously. This speaks to the persistent myth that Indigenous peoples are mysteriously damaged, typically alcoholic, and always on the brink of dying, that people on whom care would be wasted. Think about the escalating anti-Asian rhetoric, slurs and shunning observed during the pandemic. of harassment of Asian elders, women, and healthcare workers. Up on the screen, you can see a picture of a person. The person's name is Amy Huang. She's a nurse who tended to COVID patients in Vancouver, and she was the target of anti-Asian verbal assault when a rally was taking place outside of a BC hospital about the vaccine card program. She shared, "It's been physically, emotionally, and spiritually draining on all of us, but we do the best we can." Next slide, please.
Yep.
Thanks. So in Canada, historically and currently, power, privilege are distributed along racial and other sociocultural lines. As of 2011, 19% of Canadians and 26% of Ontarians identified as a visible minority. In the media, policing, medicine, and in politics in Canada, this is yet to reflect this diversity. Fields as yet don't reflect the communities that they serve. In education, in diverse Toronto, where as of 2014, about 50% of the population self-identifies as racialized, 19% of teachers identify as racialized. This seems to have played out in the recent federal election, which may have contributed to frustration about dodging of the issue of racism. Barriers and disadvantages seem to be distributed along racial and sociocultural lines. In education, we could reflect on our system data for Black, Indigenous, and Asian students in attendance, bullying, well-being, and suspension data. Clearly, there are stark divides in how groups experience Canada. This extends to our ongoing COVID-19 pandemic situation through the inequitable allocation of resources such as sick days and vaccines. So in the Toronto District School Board, we have over 47% of the student population self-identify as Asian. We'll talk about the definition of Asian shortly. We have a growing majority of Canadians agreeing that systemic racism is a serious problem. And the awareness of race and racism in Ontario and across Canada means that this is an unprecedented opportunity to take action in schools and communities. While Asians have helped to build this nation, both at a fundamental and continuous nature, Asian Canadians have nonetheless been demonized, discriminated, and removed from Canadian history. Throughout Canada's existence, anti-Asian racism has manifested in both overt and covert ways. So on this slide here, you can see an attempt to break down what's meant by the term Asian. As you can see, the definition is very broad and inclusive, but it's not really even limited to these identities. For example, Pacific Islanders, some Pacific Islanders would identify as Asian as well. As mentioned previously, this resource, it focuses on anti-Asian racism and xenophobia experienced specifically by East Asian, South Asian, and Southeast Asian identities. This is with the recognition that the racism, discrimination, and bigotry faced by communities from Central and Western Asia may be more uniquely and appropriately taken up in focused spaces, addressing anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, anti-Middle Eastern racism, and anti-Arab discrimination. In terms of a historical context, if we focus on those experiences, we know that Canadian history is really marked by contributions made by Asians in Canada and the discrimination they faced throughout by government laws and policies. Asian peoples first arrived to Canada in about the mid-1880s, fleeing poverty and famine, and they immediately contributed to the building of the Canadian Pacific Railway. At the same time, government policies were enacted to halt Asian immigration, including a head tax that applied only to Chinese people, creating barriers to the unification of Asian spouses and Asian families. In the early 1900s, segregated schools were established for Chinese students to be educated apart from white students. Segregated schooling also existed for Black students. In 1922, a year-long strike in Vancouver's Chinatown paved the way for dismantling segregation. So here we can see a very famous photo. I wonder, do you recognize this context? Does anyone recognize this?
Yes, this is the last spike where the Canadian government took a picture of all the people who were supposed to be involved in putting the last spike in the railway, and they did not acknowledge any of the Asians who've contributed to this, and the number of deaths that went into building this was not acknowledged. Even photos in the history were not acknowledged until I think something like 2007, where they made one mention of it, but past photos of Asians building the railway were still not included.
Absolutely. Thank you for adding that in. And you can see in this photo who is depicted. And in the background, we might ask who is not. And definitely 20,000 Chinese laborers and the deaths of hundreds in the name of nation building is missing here. Not to mention the colonization of land and the land grabs from First Nation communities. When the railway was completed, Asian workers went from part of being a vital part of Canada to being a threat and being unwanted. On this slide, we can see little snippets about the Chinese head tax, which is a price put on every immigrant from China to discourage Chinese from entering Canada. And it eventually escalated to the Chinese Exclusion Act, which effectively banned entry to the country by anyone from China. Other instances of Asian exclusion and othering involve the Kumata Maru incident, where over 370 Indians, mainly of Sikh background, were turned away at the Vancouver port, as well as the internment of Japanese Canadians during the Second World War. These are just a few examples of how Asians have been systematically excluded and othered in Canada. And I also mentioned previously the existence of segregated schools. Segregated schools and like partial segregation of Chinese students existed until about the 1940s. So here on this slide, you can see a summary of a few more of the more contemporary significant contributions to Canada led by Asian Canadians, including the dismantling of discriminatory policies. So the participation of Asian Canadians with Jewish Canadians to advocate for immigration changes, Gay Asian Toronto, the challenging of homophobia and the push for inclusion, and including also in 2001, a film to celebrate LGBTQ identities and to create dialogues. Those are all important parts to note in history as well. The last time that the TDSB, to our knowledge anyway, produced a document and had active discussions about anti-Asian racism was about 20 years ago. And really until relatively recently, anti-Asian racism has been relatively under-discussed and under-acknowledged. In that time, which is definitely my time in education in this place, there have been troubling questions and ideas that have emerged, including some wonderings about if Asian people experience racism, associations with so-called positive stereotypes in Asian communities. While individuals might say that it's been a long time, or they may say that it's been a long time since they experienced racism, or perhaps assert that they've never experienced anti-Asian racism, stories by individuals are different from systemic data or trends that connect to historical events unfolding over time to consistently impact communities. Anti-Asian racism, as you saw in the slices of history that I shared with you, is historic. It's always been here, and its impacts and manifestations are distinct from anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism. And it has its sting of its very own, of fear, of trepidation, of humiliation, of limitation, silencing, and erasure. If something is unarticulated because maybe we're unaware of our shared history and shared experiences of marginalization, it still exists. Manifestations of racism of all forms are ultimately connected to ideologies that are enacted by institutions and ultimately are the product of systems of power that privilege some while disadvantaging others.
Thank you, Stella. On this slide here, this will get into one of the other learning goals on what should I know about Asian identities in Canada? What should I know students' experiences of anti-Asian racism? So one of the race-based actions probably most familiar to us is the notion of model minority. The view of Asian Canadians as compliant, rule followers, exceptional, we're more hardworking, better at adjusting, more academically gifted. And this originates from the Cold War, simultaneous to changing immigration policies in the US and in Canada, the need for workers, in the context of anti-Indigenous, anti-Black racism, colonialism, and white supremacy. The reality is that the model minority myth comes at a cost. It flattens our identities and experiences. We become monolithic. Diversity diversity socioeconomically, linguistically, and learning differences. This impacts on mental health, which is also reflected in TDSB board data. It is a silencing of struggles, fatigued with meeting expectations, and conflicted with contradiction. Held up as a model, we end up being complicit in the oppressing of other marginalized groups. Some ethnic minorities are considered better, other ethnic minorities are worse. Think about the questions: what is model behavior? Who gets to define model behavior? Is the model static? Who isn't a model? A possible antidote to anti-Asian racism is to understand the history and the context that we walk into when we enter into Canada. And as Stella has shared some brief historical context, Canada was a welcoming home for many of us. But when we move into a new home, for example, we inherit the whole thing and are responsible to get to know it and do the things that we know are necessary to maintain, renovate, or overhaul it to make a place we want to live. Anti-Asian racism exists because anti-Indigenous racism and anti-Black racism exist. Some people, including Indigenous and Black people, suffer because of how Canada was set up as a hierarchy. There is a bias and discrimination that impacts some communities violently, not the meritocracy that is advertised. If we seek to address anti-Asian racism, we must understand the history of Canada and learn about allyship. The work of understanding and intergroup solidarity has been ongoing in Asian communities. It is up to us to support and encourage each other in engaging, learning, and calling for change. Indigenous, Black, and Asian struggles are inextricably linked.
At this point in our presentation, we're going to go into talking about some of the ways that schools have been engaging in conversations about anti-oppression. But I also kind of wanted to do a check-in. And I'm just wondering at this point, this is kind of on the fly, Mary. I hope it's okay.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
I'm just wondering like how you're all doing and if you have any standout points so far, comments, or any questions. Feel free to use the chat or unmute yourself. How are you all doing?
We also have an interpreter in the room as well, Stella, just so you
Beautiful.
know. Yes. Yajan, I hope I said your name correctly, is a Mandarin interpreter and if needed, is available.
So no pressure, just going to pause here for just a couple of minutes. I think looking at this material again, it's interesting to think about how much I learned in the process of writing this. I don't know if I had an opportunity in school myself to really think about the history of Canada in a way that situates like my own identity, or me to think about like my personal story in the context of Canadian history. I guess that's my reflection now. That's why I'm thinking like, what are people thinking? Because this is what I'm thinking right now.
Yeah. And it was an opportunity for writers for us to actually reflect on our own histories and learn more about our own histories as well. So within the document itself, you'll see some personal narratives woven throughout the material, which sort of helps to I guess, for myself as a reader, it really helps for me to hear personal stories if I'm reading something that has a lot of I guess deep content.
Yeah, I think because there is so little represented, I think of, if it's okay for me to say, our identities there, when I connected back to my family and then thought about things in that context, it was the only thing to do, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, it's pretty quiet in the chat now. I know you all are still thinking. So
Stella?
I'm just, Oh, sure.
Hi, it's Shirley Chan, and I
Hi.
just wanted to chime in. And I wanted to express some appreciation for this document. I think it's so timely, but it's also, but as you've mentioned and others in seeing some of these presentations before, just the piece around how there's so much that we don't know. And I think Mary just said, kind of exploring your own identity and realizing that there's so much in our stories, perhaps that haven't been shared, even with ourselves and with those that we think we know. And perhaps what an opportunity is to think that our youngest learners are now in spaces where they're sharing their stories, as opposed to kind of reflecting back as an adult about what our story was. So seeing this as a real opportunity.
Thank you.
Oh, I see there's now also a comment in the chat here.
Oh, yeah, I see it.
With the intersectionality of anti-Asian racism, with the anti-Indigenous and anti-Black racism prevalent in the country, is the Asian community particularly aware of their role as allies? That's a wonderful question.
Mm-hmm.
I think that talking about a whole community, like we're not representatives of our, we're members of those communities, but we can't speak on behalf of them. What I can definitely say is, for my part, I am very aware of the interconnectedness of our struggles and the necessity to work in allyship. So I can say that of myself, and certainly for my family and for members of my community that I'm connected to, we have those conversations often.
Mm-hmm.
I think looking out into the broader space too, there are absolutely movements of organizations focused on supporting Asian communities that also speak to that allyship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Some organizations include like Letters for Black Lives, which has translations in various languages, including Asian ones. And that's a site and document that was created by people in both the US and Canada. Is there anything you wanted to add on, Mary?
No, I would say for myself as well, and only speaking for myself, is that yes, I'm also aware. My role as an ally, myself, my family, similar to Stella, we have these conversations often, just to raise awareness, especially with our children. And I think that we are moving towards allyship. There are groups definitely pushing towards allyship, and at the same time, there's still a lot of work to do.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm going to let this question sort of sit. I think there's maybe more that I could say to it, but I'm cognizant of this framework and addressing a couple of key questions around what schools and communities are doing right now. So I'm going to move forward, and if there are any further comments onto this, or if you'd like to explore this deeper, we'll get to that after this section.
Yes, and we do bring up allyship a little bit later in the conversation as well.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's talk about this this fun diagram that's on the screen and what it means. It actually represents a framework. And what we're going to do now is we're going to break that framework down a little bit and speak to what this means for educators and school administrators in these 8 areas. There's also some applicability here for parents. And in the resource, we talk about this specifically in the context of anti-Asian racism. So we're going to introduce you to each one briefly, and we ask that you consider how each one, what each one means to you personally as a parent in your home with your kids. So the first that I want to speak to is about examining biases. We all have implicit biases that inform our beliefs and actions. From our context today, examining biases mean asking how might historically entrenched and racist stereotypes, such as the perpetual foreigner or the model minority, ideas about Asian boys as being weak or Asian girls as being passive, how might these inform my interactions with others? And then what am I doing to change that? For example, contrary to the stereotype about wealthy Asian families, data shows that most Asian families in the TDSB come from lower income groups. This stereotype may cause educators to ignore issues of access to resources for Asian students. Examining our biases and microaggressions entails a degree of discomfort, but this discomfort is a good sign that our efforts as educators and parents are anti-oppressive. The second element is about challenging power and privilege. To build anti-oppressive environments, parents and educators should continually examine their own power and privilege and teach students to do their same. What is power? Who has it and who doesn't? How might this make things more fair and equitable? As mentors for young people, we have to model vulnerability and accountability, which means admitting to them, I made a mistake, and here's how I will do better.
Recognizing intersectionalities. It is important to teach students about the intersections of race, class, gender, sexuality, and ability in order to help them understand that identity is multifaceted and fluid. Literature is a powerful and effective tool to ensure the intersectional identities are explored and discussed both at home and in the classroom. For example, in this image, you can see this is a resource entitled Scarborough by Catherine Hernandez. She's a queer Canadian writer of mixed Filipino, Chinese, Spanish, and Indian descent. This includes a multitude of stories and voices. For example, Bing, a gay Filipino boy whose father suffers from mental illness. Sylvie, an Indigenous girl whose family struggles to find permanent housing. Victor, a Black artist harassed by police. And Hina, a Muslim school worker who witnessed the impact of poverty on education with her. So her novel is a great tool for exploring nuanced intersectional identities. Leveraging marginalized voices. TDSB census portraits show that East and Southeast Asian students feel less comfortable participating, answering questions, and speaking up in class over their peers. This data underscores that we have not yet created the necessary conditions for students to feel brave to participate. For students who are English language learners, participation in obtaining a sense of belonging can be even more challenging. It's crucial that we use resources from diverse Asian perspectives and seek out voices from underrepresented groups. For example, inviting community members from particular racial, ethnic, or cultural backgrounds to share unique insights as to why some students may be struggling. The idea of holding high expectations must encompass all areas of student growth. So this includes leadership, creativity, and risk-taking, and not just solely academic achievement. Despite performing as well as or better than their peers in academic achievement, East and Southeast Asian students report feeling less confident in academic abilities. Parents and educators should seek opportunities around the school and community for these students to take risk, build confidence, and participate in leadership roles. Critically investigating historical context. So when we teach diverse histories, our students develop an understanding of who they are and why they matter. We also challenge dominant narratives of white supremacy, then teach young people to equate Canadianness with whiteness. Teach about the Kamagatu Muro incident, the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Japanese internment. Talk about your own personal family histories and journeys of migration. Confronting Canada's racist history and treatment of Asian communities dispels the myth of infallible Canadian multiculturalism in our fight for racial justice.
The seventh element of this framework is about supporting students' mental health and well-being. This area is especially important right now at a time when anti-Asian racism is on the rise, and we simultaneously have some students at home isolated from their peers as a result of the pandemic. According to TDSB census portraits, students of East Asian, East, Southeast, and South Asian descent feel like they don't have adults at school they could turn to for help. Students of East Asian and Vietnamese descent were less likely to report positive feelings about themselves or about their futures. Many of these students experience significant anxiety, loneliness, and low self-confidence. The stereotype of the quiet Asian student may make us dangerously ignorant of those who are suffering in silence. To support mental health, we must validate students' feelings and teach healthy coping strategies. Talking about race and racism is an important part of identity building and healing. We not only establish safety and trust, but we create a culture of compassion and of belonging. The final element in this framework is about mobilizing to take positive social action. One of the goals of creating anti-oppressive environments is to create social change. We can ask our students, what social issues matter to you? Where do you want to see change? How can we make change? Look for opportunities in your communities to learn about or engage in activist work with students. For example, Project 1907 is a grassroots group made of Asian women. Together, they aim to elevate Asian voices that are underrepresented and undervalued in mainstream political, social, and cultural discourse, including amplifying the voices of women. It's important for young people to know that they have a voice, and with our encouragement and support, they have the power to create change themselves. This is healing.
Thank you. Sorry, Stella, I'm just going to pause for a moment. There was a participant, Yajin, who was trying to speak earlier, and I guess we weren't able to hear.
Oh.
Yeah, so do you want to try and ask your question again? Sorry, I don't even see a question. Oh, I do see a question. However, it is not. Oh. Sorry, Yajin, do you want to ask your question again?
I think that was Yajin translating the part where it says any questions or comments so far.
Oh, okay. So, here there was a message just to me that just said that. Okay. Yeah. That we weren't able to hear him. Nobody can hear me. Yeah.
Oh, one thing that you might do is if you click that little arrow beside the microphone, perhaps you need to select the microphone to use.
Let me see if I can. I can't unmute from my end either.
Oh.
Oh, I can ask to unmute, but I don't know if that'll help. Oh, I see your microphone flashing now. Do you want to try and? Nope. It's not working. Okay, sorry. So you can also type your question in the chat as well. Okay, thank you.
Thank you for trying. I'm so sorry the technology is being difficult. Okay.
All right. Okay. Sorry, I'm just going to change this. All right. So on the screen here are just three concepts that we want, three ideas that we are just going to cover. And as defined, lateral violence is displaced violence directed against one's peers rather than adversaries. This construct is one way of explaining minority on minority violence in developed nations. It is a cycle of abuse, and its roots lie in factors such as colonization, oppression, intergenerational trauma, and the ongoing experiences of racism and discrimination. Allyship is an active process in which a person is in position of power, seeks to work in solidarity with more marginalized groups of people to dismantle oppression. Allyship is often described as lifelong work and involves consistent and ongoing effort, including unlearning and relearning, reevaluating and building trusting relationships with more marginalized individuals and groups. And solidarity may require us to give up power and take risks within social hierarchies, and intentionality to address system oppression in education, housing, healthcare, and capital resources. So we have a responsibility to address lateral racism between racialized communities. Racism and colorism exist within Asian communities, both overseas and here in Canada. Historically, aforementioned white supremacy has used the Asian model minority myth to further oppress Black and Brown communities. It is important to seek support from allies across racialized groups, and solidarity building is essential for creating anti-oppressive communities. Challenging lateral violence, working for solidarity and allyship can be invaluable. This is a way to reconnect community members, meaningfully extending the purpose for gathering beyond addressing conflict, and to establish necessary background knowledge to understand and talk about what's going on. Knowing, supporting, and respecting identities, understanding how community members self-identify, acknowledging and discussing intersectionalities can be a good first step. By addressing lateral oppression and supporting allyship means recognizing how power and privilege can play out on the individual level. Within the document also, we share ways in which we can support allyship and solidarity. So being an ally can look different depending on our social location and our own individual understanding of our own identity in relation to power and privilege. So as mentioned, allyship is a lifelong process of unlearning, relearning, and building trusting relationships with marginalized communities and amplifying their voices. So on an individual level, we can create space, listen more, and hold space to hear the ideas, opinions, and feelings of those most marginalized. Validate experiences and decentralize ourselves. Take guidance from those we seek to work with and stay committed. Recognize that mistakes will happen and take accountability for actions. This can be an uncomfortable process, so understanding that and accepting that the emotions that come with this work are normal. Counter oppression by speaking out when others speak or behave in ways that are racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic, xenophobic, ableist, ageist, and misogynist. As a collective, community organizations can work together to share resources and ideas to actively improve access for all marginalized groups. Understanding what is needed to help everyone feel safe, navigating possible barriers such as language and physical accessibility to create more inclusivity for all. Is there anything you wanted to add to this slide here, Stella?
I mean,
or?
No, I mean, maybe yes.
Okay.
But I just thinking about Valerie's question and about the points that Shirley raised, and thinking about I'm thinking about the terms on the previous slide and about this framework that's shown currently as being not just a framework to address anti-Asian racism, but one that is applicable also to building solidarities within Asian communities and others, right? So I guess to add on to how we attempted to address the question raised by Valerie, this is our understanding of how to address anti-Asian racism, but also how to build solidarities between communities that are necessary to address oppression, which is interconnected, right? And the issue of lateral violence very often comes up in these conversations of anti-Asian racism, and understandably so, because our communities live side by side with others who also experience oppression. This is something that we recognize and know. I hope that makes sense.
Okay, so oops, not changing. Oh, there we go. So we started the session with these 3 learning goals, and we'd like to just leave some space and time now for questions, comments, or if there's any sort of topic that we'd like to, bring up and just have a conversation. Thank you. Oh, is it Alex Tracy? Thank you.
I have a question. Can I?
Of course.
Yeah, I'm a parent of a student of Chinese descent, and her senior school experience was appalling, and we didn't find out about it. It could be our parents' craziness, but until she hit the COVID, basically support through COVID last year. Um, it's almost as if everything you were saying needs to be emphasized early, because the anti-Asian racism was happening in a school that was basically 95% white, and we probably should have known, but we didn't. And she was very closed about it, didn't tell us really until well into grade 11. How do you, it's early, recognizing that the cross-cultural situation, because we're adoptive parents, how would you address that on an alley in any way that would have been helpful back in grade 7 and 8? I mean, it's too late for us, but is there some way that, is there something that, some strategy that could identify, because that she didn't identify it to us. We didn't realize that that was the core of her depression until she'd been in counseling for a year.
I'm sorry that that was your child's experience. And I think that it's wonderful to hear that there are self-reflective parents that are thinking not just about their own child, but about more broadly supports for schools back then and currently. I think that's amazing. Is there something you wanted to add on to this, Mary?
No, I think the question is sort of, you know, identifiers, or how can we recognize these experiences sooner. And I think as educators, we need to commit ourselves to working, you know, creating spaces within our own classroom community and beyond, within the school community as well. So create spaces where students feel that they are able to talk about what they are experiencing within your space. You know, and as you mentioned, you know, it wasn't until, you know, the height of COVID where you may have realized that something was going on. And I think that your daughter is not alone in that. And so as educators, we have to commit ourselves to creating spaces so that these feelings don't persist and are not sort of bottled up inside for as long as many students hold them for.
For me specifically, the process of writing this, and I've always been somewhat of an equity interested person and also educator, the process of writing this was really surprisingly eye-opening, because although I felt I was relatively informed, reaching back into Canadian history and realizing that my experiences are much more broad, it was quite eye-opening. So I guess to your point about why is it that we weren't discussing this earlier, this is a very common experience, right? That it's not being discussed more broadly, and that it's relatively hidden, because anti-Asian racism is so unique. It's very different than experiences of anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism, for example, right? Or other forms of oppression. And so, you know, at this point, you know, we have a broader societal awareness of oppression, and through resources like this and other broader conversations, these things are starting. And I think that there is a specific place, especially for families that are cross-racial, to be contributing from their experience, the conversations that should be happening in families, right? So that's a very important perspective that I've been wondering about very much. There was an article written from the perspective of a transnational adoptee who, I think she was Korean, that came out in Time magazine that spoke to some of these issues, and people are raising that. And I think that, you know, where do you start in terms of being someone who can support others, like to build allyship and solidarities even within your own personal family units? It's about like reading and then sharing, like talking openly about your wonderings. And it's not an easy process, and although there's this polished final product there through this resource, it's something that I don't know how much individually as writers we were conversant in, particularly, right? As aware as we are now. Does that, I don't know if that speaks to the points.
Well, it does, and I appreciate the resource, and I will look at it, and thank you for the presentation. That's been helpful, and I hope in some way you might even share your slides, because I had trouble getting into this session, so I'm into it late. But I'm wondering if there isn't another step. I mean, one of the things that, because we all went, and there was a group of us, 6 families, so we've kept in touch, and we've been trying, the kids have been trying to support each other a bit. But if they're spread from here to Barrie, and all 6 of the young girls in their early stages experienced similar situations, and all 6 didn't basically open up to their, COVID was a great opener. All 6 students are within 5 months of each other, and the parent, we've kept in touch, and all of a sudden, sort of these are all high performing kids. They did really, really well in school, all the things that you would think of in terms of stereotype. But we obviously, none of us had the skills to know what was going on until basically grade 11, grade 12. And I'm sure we're not unique. I agree with that, but it's, I would have imagined there are still mixed nationality adoptions happening, and it's there really weren't, when we started looking around for even a counselor, it was very difficult. So I leave it up in the air, and I'm going to certainly look at your document, and maybe there's, I know conversations are difficult, especially around private stuff, but it's just in many ways wasn't so unexpected that I thought I might come to this session and just see if there was anyone else that had the same thing happen. So
yeah, thank you for sharing that. Yeah. I'm just going to put the chat.
Stella and Mary, I wonder if I'm building on what Robert has said. I wonder if there is anything that is available for these young women to connect in a way that's like a youth network, where perhaps somebody can facilitate that kind of conversation with them. Because I know that in some schools they have like, I don't know what they're called, but they're kind of like special groups where those children who are experiencing violence or discrimination or racism or bullying, but they belong to a certain group. So for instance, perhaps East Asians, and they come together and they share those experiences, and they share how they've dealt with it, so that they are building a collective history. And so for Robert and his family, it's a collective history that would be different from my collective history, because I'm Chinese and I'm not of mixed race, and I don't belong in a family that is different from my own ethnicity. So is there at this moment anything in TDSB that has that kind of network for children or adolescents, or is there a way that we can actually create something like that?
I think that that's a wonderful question. I think back to during the time when we were all virtual, for example, of the rise of there was like a large GSA network that emerged that was kind of amazing. And you wonder about the possibilities that technology offers to connect students that are across like a wide span, but have that same common history. To my knowledge right now within the TDSB, that doesn't exist. That doesn't mean that it can't in the future or won't. I also think of another program that I'm aware of that's offered in a different region, like in New York region, that focuses on living well, taking action, it's called. And it focuses on mental health. And I'm sure that these issues of both mental health and mixed heritage come up there too. But within TDSB right now, no. And I think the possibility is there.
Mm-hmm.
Makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah.
I don't want to take up too much time, but
No.
we eventually found a counselor through Hong Fu, which is a Chinese Mental Health Association. And, but they weren't connected to our families. They were connected. We found them through searching through community associations. So I don't know whether that's available to everybody.
Hong Fu is amazing. Yeah. Within this resource in the final pages, you'll see lists of community resources, and they're one that's listed there. So if others are looking,
that's
please do check that out.
Yeah, that's what I was just pulling up at the end of the resource. We do list some community organizations. Obviously, we could not encompass all. And so, yeah.
Well, thank you very much. And thanks for your extra time.
You're most welcome. I see here Sharon saying there are cultural groups in her elementary school and high schools, and that's true. There certainly are. Valerie, I see that you have a hand raised.
So I'm a co-chair of a model school, and I didn't realize until a couple of years ago, pre-COVID, when we actually got to have like a winter concert, which was the first one we'd ever had, how many Asian parents were in our school. Like we knew, like we have 29 different home languages at our school. We know our school is super, super diverse. But I was blown away just because like that was an event that this community wanted to participate in, like how many there were. So, but really what that did was show that everything else that we do is not something that connects to this community. And we've kind of struggled since then to identify ways that we can reach out, and like the Chinese community within our school seems very like together, like they're their community, and they don't seem to have interest, or maybe that's just me projecting, I don't know, in participating in kind of the community, school community at large. But we would love to hear their voices. We'd love to hear what is important to them. We'd love to hear like what they want to see happen at our school, but we don't know how to get those voices to the table. And I don't know, like, if it's because they're disenfranchised. I don't know if it's because, like, I don't know what it is, right? Like, I don't know why it is. I don't know if it's because they have experienced anti-Asian racism. I don't know how to tackle it. Or our council as a whole doesn't really know. Like, we've done a lot of anti-oppression work together as a school in the last few years. Our admin is wonderful, but it seems to be that community specifically that it either isn't interested, and if that's the case, that's fine. But if it's not that it's an interest thing, if it's something deeper, if it's something else, I want to try to figure out how to address it.
I think that's a common, I've heard that before. Did you want to say anything to that, Mary?
No. I was just going to say it's similar to what yours, like it's not uncommon and it's not unheard of, like in terms of even having, parent council voices that represent the Asian community. And there are numerous factors that can contribute to that, right? We don't know what home life, we don't know what work life, we don't know schedules. So a multitude of factors, and quite possibly even the historical silencing of our voices, where, my parents were always like, oh, just go to school, do what you're supposed to do and listen, and like, they never went to parent-teacher interviews. They never communicated with teachers. Like, there was no communication there. So there's a long history of that also I can speak for in terms of my own family.
Absolutely. That resonates with me. And just, I think personally about the circumstances under which my family immigrated, right? It just makes it very difficult. It limits participation. And the circumstances are such that, you're supposed to fit in, right? Like you're supposed to go to school and learn how to be Canadian. And that this is historic, right? For me, I don't know about that currently, but historically, that's what's been the message that I personally, individually received. And so, it is a little bit about helping community and family to understand the purpose of engagement, and about inviting that engagement in ways that are meaningful to to them. So I don't have a simple answer, unfortunately. I think that what I would begin to think about is where community members are, right? Can we frequent their stores or frequent their businesses and build authentic relationships in their contexts? And then from there, explore what it means to have just that relationship, what that means, and then explore what that means in schools. In addition, I think about other events that come up, like Mid-Autumn Festival just came up, and the Lunar New Year is coming, and those are definitely like more event kind of things, but they're culturally relevant events that you can speak to that are an opportunity to do some cross-cultural sharing, which is the beginning of what could be a longer, more meaningful relationship, right? And also, how when those parents come in, how do they know that they're welcome? Is another question, right? So I think about like representation of language and images to books that students are reading. I'm sure that these are things based on what you're sharing, like the fact that you're asking this question, I'm sure that your council has explored these ideas, but I don't have a quick answer, but that's where I start to think about.
Yeah. Yeah, like as Stella was saying, there's no quick answer, but I can only say is that we can't stop trying.
Yeah, for sure. Like it's one of those, because we have so many different cultures at our school, it sometimes makes it difficult to, keep reaching out to all of them and trying to bring them into the fold and to share our diversity, not to assimilate, not to say that this is what it means to be Canadian, but that like your version of Canadian is as valid as my version of being Canadian, and it's all beautiful and wonderful and welcome. And yeah, it's just trying to keep pushing so that people know that and feel welcome that way.
For sure. I mean, perhaps a topic of conversation, like short term, could be like a conversation about experiences of this, right? It's a negative topic to be united towards, but it is the basis for that would bring folks together short term to talk about what this means and what it might mean to try to address this, and mental health awareness specifically in support of, but for all, right? That's one possible basis. So we have about a minute left, and just want to invite any others who want to ask any questions or have any comments about our presentation today. We would invite those, and actually we would love to stay connected, so feel free. I'm on Twitter. You can always find me there, and also through the board. We're definitely findable, both of us. I'm seeing a comment here. Agincourt Collegiate in the east of Toronto is a high school that really embraces supporting the Asian community through many platforms. Absolutely.
Parenthetically, my daughter actually monitored a couple of classes at Agincourt. We don't live anywhere near, but she was particularly comfortable because the math teacher there responded to her and was also Chinese. So there was a cross-cultural connection. It made quite a bit of difference in grade 12.
It's so interesting. I remember going into classrooms, and I would see the sole Asian student there, and they would come to me. And I also remember back to when I was growing up about how meaningful that was. It wasn't until OAC that I had an Asian teacher for the first time, and just how meaningful that was. I surprised myself that meant something.
Yeah. And thank you for sharing, Robert. When I was teaching a grade 6 class, I had a student, she was adopted also, and her parents reached out to me often because she identified with me as Asian, and her parents reached out to me often in terms of just like checking in and connecting just to make sure, and it's important that student identities are also visible within like staff so that they have someone that they're able to connect with.
Yeah, the reality is that you get treated different and you experience the world differently. Continue to, regardless of how normalized it can feel some of the time. All right, I'm just seeing the time, it's about
Yeah.
12:31, and I know that there is break time in between your sessions. So thank you so much for attending.
Yes, thank you.
And we hope you enjoy the rest of your time with the conference.
Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Everyone, have a great day.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Bye. Thank
Thank you,
you.
Mary.
Thank you.